She found him on a Tuesday. Which is to say, she found him on the most ordinary day of the week, in the most extraordinary circumstances of her life, in the long grass of the African savanna, where he lay alone and trembling and so small she could have held him in both hands. The pride had gone. They had made their calculation, the cold, unsentimental arithmetic of survival, and he had not added up. Too small. Too weak. The one who would cost more than he could contribute. So they left him. And she looked at him. And he looked at her. And in that silence, thin and sharp and humming with everything unsaid, he asked her the only question that mattered. "Are you going to leave too?" She didn't. 5 years later, she drove out to the eastern plain to find out if he remembered. What happened when she stepped out of that vehicle will stay with you for the rest of your life. Chapter 1, The One They Left Behind. There is a particular kind of silence that follows abandonment. It is not the silence of peace, or rest, or the deep, unhurried quiet of a world going about its ancient business. It is a different silence entirely, thin and sharp and faintly wrong, the way a note held just a fraction too long begins to curdle into something uncomfortable. It is the silence of absence. Of a space that should be filled and isn't. Of a small creature making sounds that are answered by nothing, and slowly, with the particular cruelty of dawning understanding, beginning to grasp what nothing means. He had been there when they left. That was the thing that would stay with her long after everything else, the knowledge that it had not been an accident, not an oversight, not the careless geography of a pride moving on without noticing one small straggler falling behind. They had known he was there. And they had gone anyway. The pride had made its judgment with the calm, absolute, unsentimental efficiency of creatures for whom survival is not a philosophy but a daily arithmetic, and the cub had not added up. He was the smallest. He was the weakest. He was, by the cold and irrefutable logic of the wild, the one who would cost more than he could contribute. So they left him in the grass. In the particular silence that follows abandonment. In the vast, golden, indifferent savanna that does not deal in fairness or second chances or the aching, stubborn belief that every life, no matter how small, no matter how inconvenient, no matter how comprehensively the odds have stacked themselves against it, deserves a chance to become what it was always meant to be. She found him on a Tuesday. She would always remember that. Not because Tuesdays are significant, they are, by any reasonable measure, the least dramatic day of the week, but because the ordinary days are the ones that change everything. The extraordinary moments never announce themselves. They arrive disguised as Tuesdays, in the long grass, wearing the face of a lion cub so small she could have held him in both hands, whose eyes, when they found hers, contained a question so direct and so enormous and so painfully simple that she felt it land somewhere behind her sternum and stay there. "Are you going to leave too?" She did not leave. Chapter TWO, The Decision That Changed Everything. Nobody told her it would be easy. Nobody, in fact, told her much of anything that was particularly useful in the days that followed, because the days that followed were unlike anything that any manual, any training program, any accumulated body of wildlife expertise had quite thought to prepare a person for. Raising a lion cub rejected by his pride is not, it turns out, a straightforward undertaking. It requires, among other things, the patience of someone who has entirely forgotten what sleep is, the nerve of someone who can hold a trembling, furious, needle-toothed small predator against their chest at 2 in the morning and think not about the claws but about the heartbeat, and the particular quality of stubbornness that refuses to acknowledge the possibility of failure even when failure is making a very compelling case for itself at 3, 4, and 5 in the morning as well. His name came to her on the third night. She had been sitting with him in the low golden light of the rescue center, his small body curled against her side with the boneless, absolute trust of a creature who has decided, with no particular evidence to support the decision, that this human is safe. She had been watching him breathe, the small, rapid, achingly fragile rise and fall of his ribs, and she had been thinking about the pride that left him, about the cold arithmetic of their departure, about what it means to be deemed not enough by the very creatures who should have been the first to choose you. And the name arrived, the way the right names always do, not invented but recognized, as though it had been waiting for her to catch up with it. Simba. No, something older. Something that belonged to the land rather than the story. Something that meant, in the tongue of the people who had known this landscape since before any recorded history had thought to write it down. He who endures. She whispered it into the dark of the rescue center. He opened one eye, regarded her with the expression of supreme and unimpressed evaluation that lion cubs apparently deploy universally regardless of circumstance, and then closed it again. It was, she decided, as close to approval as she was going to get. She took it. Chapter 3, The Education of a Lion.
What are you doing,
The first year was chaos. Magnificent, exhausting, irreplaceable chaos. He grew the way lion cubs grow, which is to say, at a rate that seems biologically improbable until you are the one responsible for feeding him, at which point it seems not merely improbable but personally targeted. The small, trembling creature who had fit in her cupped hands became, with a speed that felt almost like a conjuring trick, a bundle of muscle and mischief and absolutely spectacular poor decision-making. He knocked over everything that could be knocked over. He chewed through everything that could be chewed through. He regarded every piece of equipment in the rescue center as an obstacle course designed specifically for his enrichment and the despair of the people who maintained it. She taught him what she could. She taught him boundaries, mostly by discovering them together, in the particular collaborative spirit of two individuals who are both making up the rules as they go and hoping desperately that they are making up the right ones. She taught him the geography of the reserve, every waterhole, every copy, every stretch of long grass where the guinea fowl nested and the warthogs made their ridiculous, indignant exits. She taught him, through the slow and patient language of presence, that the world did not require him to be afraid. That it was large and golden and full of astonishing things. That he was allowed to take up space within it. And he taught her things in return, because that is what animals do when you are paying attention, which she always was. He taught her that courage is not the absence of trembling. He taught her that trust, once given by a creature with every reason to withhold it, is the most serious and sacred thing in the world. He taught her that there is a particular quality of joy, uncomplicated, physical, whole-bodied, that humans spend their entire lives attempting to locate and that lion cubs find effortlessly in a shaft of morning sunlight and a pile of dry leaves. She filed all of these lessons away carefully. She suspected she would need them. She was right. Chapter 4, The Years Between. The second year was harder than the first, and the third harder than the second, and the fourth brought challenges that none of the previous three had prepared her for, because that is the particular and irreducible truth of raising something wild. It does not plateau. It does not reach a comfortable equilibrium and stay there, obligingly, while you catch your breath. It keeps becoming. It keeps demanding more of you than the version of yourself that existed yesterday had available to give. And the only adequate response is to become more too, to grow in the direction it requires, even when, especially when, that direction is uncomfortable and uncertain and nothing like what you had planned. There were days when she wondered. Not about him, never about him, but about herself. About whether she was doing it right. About whether the choices she was making on his behalf were truly for him or secretly for her, for the particular and slightly shameful comfort of being needed by something magnificent. About whether love, when it crosses the vast distance between species, is always entirely honest about its own motives. These are not small questions. They sat with her through the long African nights, under skies so full of stars they seemed almost extravagant, and she sat with them in return, and did not pretend to easy answers. Because she understood, by year 3, that he was becoming what he was always meant to be. That the wild was not an abstract concept to him but a living, breathing, irresistible call, a frequency she could not hear but he felt in his bones, in his blood, in the deepening golden weight of the manner that was now framing a face that had forgotten, entirely, that it had ever been small enough to hold in 2 hands. He was no longer the cub who had looked at her in the long grass and asked his silent, devastating question. He was something else now. Something vast and self-possessed and magnificently, unambiguously certain of its own place in the world. She was glad. She was proud. She was, in the private hours, something she could not quite name, a feeling that lives in the exact borderland between joy and grief and refuses, with the stubbornness of all truly important emotions, to be resolved into either one. Chapter 5, 5 years later. 5 years. She had not counted the days. She had counted other things, feeding schedules and veterinary appointments and the slow, incremental measurements of a creature growing into himself, but not the days as days, not as units of time passing, not in the way that implies a reckoning is coming. And yet here it was. 5 years since a Tuesday in the long grass. 5 years since a question asked in silence by a creature too young to have the words for it. 5 years since she had made a decision in the space of a heartbeat that had reorganized the entire architecture of her life around a single, non-negotiable fact. She had loved him. She had raised him. She had let him go. And now the Land Rover was moving through the eastern plain in the amber light of late afternoon, and the radio crackled with the coordinates the ranger had called in an hour ago, and she was sitting very still in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap and her heart doing something complicated and loud that she was choosing not to examine too closely. 5 years was a long time. 5 years was long enough for a lion to become fully, irreversibly himself. Long enough to forget a human voice. Long enough for the wild to complete the work she had started and leave nothing behind but what had always been there, what she had always been working toward, even in the moments when the working had been hardest. She did not know if he would remember her. She did not know, and the not knowing was enormous, and she sat with it in the amber light of the late African afternoon and did not look away from it, because she had learned, in 5 years of loving something wild, that the things you refuse to look at are always the things that matter most. The vehicle stopped. The ranger pointed. And she looked up. And there he was. He was everything. He was the small trembling cub and the adolescent chaos and the slow, golden becoming and the 5 years and the long grass and the Tuesday, all of it, all at once, standing in the amber light of the eastern plain with his great mane moving in the evening wind and his amber eyes, which had always seen everything, finding her with an ease that suggested, quietly, without drama, without the slightest concession to the enormity of the moment, that he had known she was coming. He moved toward her. Not running. Not the urgent, stumbling, desperate sprint of fear or confusion. But the deep, unhurried, absolutely certain walk of a creature approaching something it has already decided about. Something it decided, perhaps, on a Tuesday in the long grass 5 years ago. Something that was never, not for a single moment of those 5 years, in any doubt. She stepped out of the vehicle. The ranger made a sound behind her. She did not hear it. He stopped 3 feet from her. And she looked at him, this magnificent, impossible, fully wild, fully himself creature who had once fit in her cupped hands, and he looked back at her with those amber eyes that had always contained, from the very first moment, something that knew her. And he did what lions do not do. What no field guide has ever recorded. What nobody who was present that evening would ever entirely succeed in explaining to anyone who wasn't. He leaned his great head against her chest. And she put her arms around his neck. And neither of them moved for a very long time. Chapter 6, What 5 years taught her. She would be asked, in the years that followed, what it was like. Journalists would ask it. Researchers would ask it. Strangers at airports, who had seen the footage and tracked her down through the unreasonable alchemy of the internet, would stop her and ask it with a particular urgency, as though the answer might contain something they needed, something the ordinary categories of their lives had not been able to provide. What was it like to raise a lion? What was it like to let him go? What was it like to stand in the amber light of the African plain 5 years later and feel his great head against your chest and know that the wild had not taken him from you, that love, when it is honest enough and patient enough and brave enough to want the thing it loves to be free, does not end with the leaving? She gave different answers at different times, because it was a question that deserved different answers depending on who was asking and what they needed to hear. But the answer she gave herself, in the private hours, under the stars of the savanna that had witnessed all of it, the finding and the raising and the teaching and the letting go and the return, was simpler than any of the others. It was this? He taught me that love is not possession. That the deepest love, the kind that lasts, the kind that survives 5 years and 1,000 miles of wild and the vast, indifferent passage of time, is not the love that holds on. It is the love that is willing, at the right moment, with a full heart and steady hands, to open. To trust that what you have built between you is real enough to survive the distance. To believe, against the evidence of everything the world usually teaches us about loss, that some bonds are not broken by separation. That they are, in fact, made whole by it. The savanna does not lie. It does not flatter. It does not deal in comfortable fictions about the nature of things. But on that evening, in the amber light of the eastern plain, with a lion's great head resting against a human heart that had chosen, 5 years ago, not to leave, it told a truth more complicated and more beautiful than any of its usual ones. It said, some things were always going to find their way back. It said, the love that lets go is the love that lasts. It said, look what you made. Look what you had the courage to release. Look what returned. He found his way back on a Thursday. There are stories that entertain. There are stories that move you. And then there are the rare ones, the ones that arrive quietly and rearrange something fundamental in the way you see the world and your place within it. This is one of those stories. It is a story about rejection and rescue, and the long, difficult, magnificent work of raising something wild. About the courage it takes to love something enough to let it go. About what it means, truly means, when something that has every reason to forget you chooses, instead, to come back. Subscribe to Animal Heroes. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that some things are worth staying for. And leave us a comment, what moment in this story hit you hardest? We read every single one. Because stories like this one only matter as much as the people who carry them forward. Be one of those people.